Hey there, I'm Leon Larouche with Trivium Writing, and in today's video, I want to show you how you can become a published author using the investigative journalist approach. Now, this approach works well for people who have an idea for a nonfiction book, but they don't have the time or they don't have the skills to actually write the book. And so, what the investigative journalist approach does is that it takes away all of the burden in the writing process. Now, before we get into what the actual approach is, let's just rewind a little bit and talk about what actually makes writing difficult. You know, what's funny about writing is that we do it every single day. We do it for a variety of purposes, and most of the time it's actually not that hard. When you write your emails, when you write your memos, when you write social media content, it's not that difficult to write. But for some reason, when it comes to writing a nonfiction book, and understandably so, it's difficult. You have to find the unity, you have to find the narrative, you have to create an outline and make sure that the text is coherent for a target reader. Now, what makes writing difficult isn't the writing itself, it's the thinking that goes into what we write and what we don't write. Because let's face it, if you have ideas or a message or expertise that you want to put out in a nonfiction book, you're not going to put everything in the book, right? There's a great mental model called the map is not the territory. And what it says is that on a map, you only see what you actually need to get from point A to point B. And the same thing is true with writing. When you write a nonfiction book, you're making a point for your reader. You're teaching your reader something. And so you don't need to put every single thing that you know. And so for that reason, it's difficult to write, because then you have to ask yourself, well, what do I write? What do I not write? How do I know what is necessary and what is relevant for the target reader? So there's a lot of thinking that goes into the writing process, and that's nothing to say about coming up with a good concept, coming up with a good hook for the book. And then obviously there's the publishing aspect, but we won't talk about this in this video. Now, think about it this way. When you were back in high school or in college or in graduate school, you had to take exams, right? And you were asked questions and you had to answer these questions. And if you study, you could answer these questions no problem, right? And so there was no confusion, no writer's block. You would just answer the question. And it was easy to write back then because you had clear questions. Now I want you to think about it this way. Writing at the end of the day is nothing but answering questions, whether we realize it or not. If you take a text, if you take a book, or if you take anything that's written, you can turn it into a question. You can turn it into a series of questions. And so what happens though is that most people, when they write, they start with the answers. And it's not the most effective way to write, to start with the answers, because then you don't have clarity about where it is that you need to be taking your readers. In fact, you don't have clarity about what your reader is asking themselves, because if you're writing a nonfiction book, it's to answer a big question. And the way that you answer this big question is by answering smaller questions. So what you need to do in order to write effectively is start with the questions, not the answers. And that's why I call this the investigative journalist approach, because what does a journalist do? Well, he or she asks questions. Their job is to ask really smart questions and go to the bottom of things. And when you're writing a nonfiction book, your job is to get to the bottom of things. And the way you can do that is by asking questions. And you know, for some people, writing just comes naturally and they can create a structure and they can write easily by starting with the answers, but that's because they are wired to think through questions, so they don't even have to do it. So what does this mean to you? What this means is, if you want to take the fast lane to becoming a published author, you need to start with the questions. And most of the time, you already know what the big questions are. In fact, the question you need to be answering is probably the question that has been obsessing you for years and years on end. And maybe it's a series of questions that you get frequently asked, either by your clients, either by your peers, either by your family members or friends. And so you need to make an inventory of all the really good questions that you, as an individual, as a expert or entrepreneur, academic, whoever you are, need to make an inventory of these questions that you can answer. And these questions should inform the way that you write. They should inform the contents of your book. And so if you start with the questions as opposed to with the answers, then it becomes all the easier to write because you know exactly what to do. And this is actually the way that I work with clients. So the people that come into my book accelerator program, what I do for them is I ask them all the right questions in the right order so that they can write the book easily, and it doesn't even feel like writing a book. It just feels like expressing their thoughts and informing and educating people. Now, if you're not working with me, what you might want to do is take all the questions that you already know and ask your audience all the questions. Now, of course, then you have to figure out a way to get these questions in the right order and, vet these questions to make sure they are the right questions. But this is a really good way to start. And then if you need help, if you need a writing partner, then that's where I come in and you can join my book accelerator program. But this is where you start. You start with the questions. Start thinking through questions and then come up with the answers. And that's going to make your book writing process so much easier than if you just try to, pull together paragraphs without having a clear direction. So this is the investigative journalist approach to writing. And if you implement that, which you can, as of today, if you can ask questions, you can write. So if you implement the investigative journalist approach, then you will be able to start your writing journey and easily become a published author.